It is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Sandy Knapp, who will give the opening lecture of this conference, which is supported by the BBVA Foundation. Sandy is hidden some. Sandy was born in California, but has spent most of her research career in London. She is individual merit researcher at the Natural History Museum London and has recently been appointed interim head of research at that institution. She has served as president of the Linnean Society, vice president and past president of the IAPT, and her contributions have been recognized with the Rolf Dahlgren Prize, the Peter Raven Award, the Linnean Medal, and her election to the Academia Europeana and the American Academy of Arts and Science, among others. She's also fellow of the Royal Society and an officer of the Order of the British Empire. What has Sandy done for our botanical community? Well, actually, she has done a lot, and in a variety of activities, all of which are interconnected. Perhaps the first aspect that you associate to her name is with understanding the diversity of a giant genus, Solanum, with 1,300 species and the whole family Solanaceae. She is an outstanding plant taxonomist who has described nearly 100 species, collected 18,000 specimens in 31 countries, and cited nearly 30,000 specimens in her 190 works. But more than that, her work has deepened our understanding of the evolution of the group. And with that, in its phylogenetic relationships, biography, diversification patterns, and doing so, she has provided the evolutionary context for understanding relevant traits and genes in relatives of important crops, such as tomato, potato, and eggplants. But what makes Sandy even more special is the way she does her work, because she does it in a truly collaborative way across frontiers, with leadership, generosity, and enthusiasm. And this has created a large international community, I would say almost a model for international collaboration and partnership between North and South researchers. There are two other facets of her work which are also well known and which are also related to her energy. One is her outstanding ability to lead the nomenclature section as president during the last 3 IBCs, a difficult job, by the way, and her efforts to make the nomenclature an even more useful tool for naming plants and fungi. And the other facet is her ability to communicate enthusiastically about plants in general media. So it's my great pleasure, Sandy, to give you the floor.
How can I possibly follow that? That's someone I possibly don't really even recognize. So when the organizing committee asked me to give this talk, I thought opening an international botanical congress is an enormous honor. And so what should I talk about? I thought, could I talk about Solanaceae? Might I talk about something else? But I thought I would try to answer, or try to bring some of my ideas about answering some of those questions which I get asked all the time. And those things are, why botany? Why are you a botanist? And the other question I often get asked is, why now? Why is now important? So I've got to find the thing to change. So I thought I would just explore those two questions through a very personal journey, through just some thoughts, and then perhaps leave you, and we can think about these things over the course of this week. And maybe at the end of the week, what I hope is that by this coming together in such a large number of people with, as Gonzalo said, many, many interactions, that we can come together to perhaps begin to answer some of these questions. So as a community, we can say to people, yes, it is botany, and it is now. So I'd like to thank the organizing committee for this opportunity. This is it's very exciting to stand here in front of you all. And I also would like to thank the Fundación BBVA for sponsoring this lecture. I hadn't realized they had, but thank you very, very much. I want to start by reminding us that this planet on which we live is blue and green. Green, blue being the dominant color, but green being the color that we're thinking about this evening. And oops, let's go back. And one of the things about this planet is it's the only, as far as we know, this is the only habitable planet in the solar system. That is an extraordinary thing. It's extraordinarily rare. It's not as if we can just move a block away and find another one. This is the only one. And plants are at the center of the functioning of our planet. If you look at gross primary productivity over the world, we can see how important the tropical zone is for driving how our planet works. But if we look a little bit deeper at this, we can see that even in those places where we have leaf loss in the winter months, that you can see that gross primary productivity varies throughout the year. And you can see that our planet has a heartbeat, which is driven by plants. It's driven by photosynthesis and by the increase and decrease of gross primary productivity throughout the year. So I want us to think about this heartbeat of plants, which is also true and driven by fungi, which are an integral partner with plants, but that this is what drives our planet. It drives the functioning of that blue and green jewel on which we live. And I want to apologize to start out with. Everybody always tells me never to apologize, but I'm going to apologize for talking about terrestrial ecosystems. We know that there's many, many plants and fungi and algae that live in the sea and are marine, but because my expertise is terrestrial, and I said this would be personal, I'm really going to talk about terrestrial ecosystems mostly. Plants have been absolutely integral to the development of cultures, not only today, but also in the past. Some of those cultures have come and gone, but plants have remained throughout, and they've continued to influence the development of culture and human culture worldwide. They continue to be important in our everyday lives. They're the food that we eat, they're the air that we breathe. And they also provide the beauty with which we surround ourselves every day. We must never, ever forget the importance of the beauty of plants and the aesthetic that they bring to all of our lives. Now, as both Pat and Gonzalo said, 7 years ago, we were in Shenzhen, in China, at the 19th International Botanical Congress. And out of the 19th International Botanical Congress came the Shenzhen Declaration, which was a multi-point plan which was aimed at our community, to encourage our community to do things more collaboratively, to integrate, to respect local and indigenous knowledge, to look at new technologies, and to look at really activating taxonomy to create the tools that we need with which to describe biodiversity. Now, I was talking to someone the other day, and they said, well, you know, nothing has really come of the Shenzhen Declaration. And I said, you know what? I beg to differ. I think this has made a difference. It might not have made a difference in that someone said, I did this because the Shenzhen Declaration said I should. But it's created that feeling within our community that there are important things that we must do as a community. And I'll come on to declarations at the very, very end of my talk. So look at a few of these things, and I'm not going to read them out, but some of these things I'll use examples of work that has really been, which addresses these things in the Shenzhen Declaration. In the intervening years between the Shenzhen International Botanical Congress and today, there's also been the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which aspires by 2020 to see that biodiversity is valued, conserved, restored, and widely used, maintaining ecosystem services and sustaining a healthy planet and delivering benefits essential for all people. Now, this is important because this is about us as much as it is about plants. And it might actually be more than just about us. This is also about every other organism with which we share the planet, all of whom, I believe, have agency and are sharing with us this planet, which is the only place that we have. And the Global Biodiversity Framework has some goals: nature protected and restored, nature's contributions to people valued and maintained, the benefits of this equitably shared, and resources and capacity secured. So that's a really big framework. We'll do that by reducing threats, by meeting needs, and by looking for tools and solutions. And as a mission for 2020 is to take urgent action to halt and reverse biodiversity loss. And I'm not going to read the rest, but this is the framework into which I'd want to put the comments that I'll make tonight, and what I think we ought to take away with us from today and go forward into the week, thinking about how we as a community can help achieve this Kunming Montreal biodiversity vision. Also last year was published a paper which is called The 100 Most Important Questions in Plant Science in the New Phytologist. And in there, this is the word cloud that came out of the questions. And you can see that there are three things that stand out, which are climate change, foods, and crops. And this is because many people think of plants as being about agriculture, which is absolutely true. Without plants and agriculture, we wouldn't be here. But you can see a few other words in this word cloud, things like species, and environment, and diversity, sustainable, natural, indigenous, genetic, and global. So those words, actually, in that word cloud, mean that really we have a challenge here, which is much bigger than just climate change, crops, and food. We have a challenge that stretches across a huge range. Now, in that same paper, they analyzed a paper that had been published in 2011, asking the 100 most important questions in plant science in 2011. And on your left, on my right, is the network analysis of the words from the paper in 2011. And you can see that this has three sort of nexi, one of which is around crops, one of which is around pathogens, and one of which is about improving knowledge and cells. So that's pretty applied. When we look at the word network that comes from the paper that was published last year, we can see that this is much more complex. So people studying plants and botany are thinking about a greater complexity and interconnectedness of things than they were in 2011. So the world has changed a lot in the last 10 plus years. Here you can see there are clouds around food, climate, and change, but also around environment, crop, community, and sustainable. So looking at this means our world, instead of becoming simpler with just one question to answer, that one question, why botany, why now, it's actually become more complicated. But more complicated is good, because more complicated means there's more questions for us to address, and there's more things for us to do. So I just want to emphasize environment for a minute. Oftentimes when we think environment, and when I talk to school children in my museum, they often think of the environment as being the Amazon rainforest. And yes, the Amazon rainforest is an incredibly important environment, but environments span a huge range of different places. There's things like the Amazon rainforest here. There's our temperate rainforests in the northern hemisphere. There are the acacia woodlands of the savannas of Africa. And there are dry areas, which often people think are of very little importance. But if you notice the common thread in all of these photographs of environments, that commonality is plants. That commonality is that plants are the structure and makeup of these ecosystems. They're sort of the framework in which the rest of biodiversity sits. So they're critically important, no matter how big and no matter how small. So tonight, I'd just like to take three areas of this word network and explore those a little bit in the context of another really big and important global set of goals. And I want to take crops, then I want to take the environment, and then I would like to take this last cloud, which is about community and sustainability. And I'd like to talk about this in the context of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which were established in 2015, and this is 17 goals, which we're going to get to by 2030, so lots of work to do, everybody. So we're going to get to these goals by 2030, But they're important goals for our human condition. They're also important for the biodiversity that underpins all of them. So although there isn't one of these that says biodiversity, biodiversity is critically important to them all. But what I'd like to do is take just 3 of these, because we'd probably be here till next week if I took all of them. I'll just take 3 of these and explore these in the context of why botany and why now. And the first of these is zero hunger. And this, for me, has to do with cultivation. This has to do with agriculture. And what this has to do with as well is, if we think about a solutions-based science, is this has to do with solutions from nature. This is nature providing us with solutions to problems we have. The next one I want to take up is life on land, the goal about conserving life on land. And for me, this has to do with conservation. And again, looking at it in a solutions-based framework, this is about solutions for nature. And then last, but absolutely not least, and probably the most important of all, is collaboration, is partnerships for the goals. And collaboration as a community is how any of these goals will be even partway reached. So starting with cultivation, we all eat food. I didn't eat very much last week while I was chairing the nomenclature section, but we all eat food. And everyone on the planet depends upon food. And food comes from plants. Whether it be cultivated in monocultures, extensive monocultures, or whether it's cultivated in local ways with local means. Food is central to what we do as human beings. It's also central to our relationship, our very intimate relationship with plants. People often talk about domestication as if people have done it. But actually, I'm not so sure that plants haven't domesticated us. We carry them around, we water them, we look after them. How is that not domestication? So it's worth turning things on their head and thinking about them in a slightly different way. There are many, many varieties of food around the world. Diets around the world are quite diverse, and they have been in the past. We've shared foods. One of the things that people take with them when they go across oceans and migrate is they take food. They take their favorite foods. Ships crossing the Atlantic with their dreadful human cargo. People took food from where they came, and established that in their new lands. So food is integrally important to culture and civilization. But food is changing around the world. A paper that was done by my colleague Colin Cowrie in 2014, so this is 10 years old now, he looked at the FAO statistics for the kinds of foods that are consumed in countries. And what he did is he looked at similarity indices of diets in countries, at a country level across the world. And what he found is that although on a point level, in any given place, we have more diverse diets today than we ever have, globally, our diets are more the same. So diet is becoming homogenized around the world. We're losing the special varieties and crops that people cultivate in different parts of the world, which should be as important to us as the conservation of wild biodiversity, the conservation of the diversity of those crops, because this also brings us that capacity to combat climate change in our food systems. So here is a woman in Tanzania who's selling Solanum ethiopium, the scarlet eggplant, the orange one, and tomatoes. So these are, one is something that grows natively in Africa, the other is an introduced thing. They're both equally important in the diet of this area. And plant breeders are an important community in thinking about using plants and thinking about using plants in the future. And plant breeders are a community that often my community of systematists doesn't really talk to. And so I want to introduce this tiny thread of collaboration here at the beginning, because one of the things that has enriched my life as a botanist is collaborating and communicating with people who are completely different to me. And these are 2 tomato breeders discussing how we can make tomatoes that have more fruits on a single truss. Something I never thought I would be interested in, but I am. And being involved with plant breeders also led me to be involved with very big genome sequencing projects, which resulted in tools which the rest of the community is using. Perhaps not many systematists are using these tools, but these are tools which we're learning to use as a community of systematists, but genomics people are using these already. And plant breeders, these are really, really important. And one of the ways in which collaboration can happen between plant breeders and people like me is to look at phylogenetics and look at relationships of things with plant breeders in mind, to think about what might be the questions they would like to have asked, rather than always thinking about the questions I want to ask, thinking about what questions might someone else want the answers to. And this led to work that I did with Xavier Obrio, who, to look at the relationships of eggplants or berenjenas or aubergines, whatever we want to call them, and to look at the relationships of those, which completely overturned the general idea of eggplant evolution. But what was important about this is this was done in collaboration, in conjunction with plant breeders like Jaime Projens from Valencia here in Spain, who's probably here, he might be here tonight. Hello if you are, Jaime, who is an eggplant breeder who's looking to improve eggplants in the face of climate change. Eggplants are a relatively drought-resistant crop, but looking at wild species of Solanum to cross these with the cultivated eggplant led to an amazing thing done in Jaime's lab, which is to cross Solanum elagnifolium there in the middle, which is a globally invasive weed, which is massively drought-resistant. And I mean, you cannot get rid of Solanum elagnifolium. And in a way, that's kind of what we want our crops to be like, isn't it? We want them to be resistant to everything. So what they did is they crossed Solanum elagnifolium, which is not particularly closely related to the cultivated eggplant, with the cultivated eggplant using tissue culture, and created an eggplant that, might not be the greatest thing since sliced bread, but is actually a step towards looking at introducing those characters from that wild species, which no one would have ever thought was interesting, into the cultivated eggplant. And you can see from the paper that was published that you have different root systems, but very similar phenolics. And phenolics are the kinds of things that are the antioxidants that are important for us in eating aubergines. So it's kind of one of those stories that you thought, this can never happen. But it did, and it did because a conversation began, and a collaboration began, and the conversation continued. And it wasn't just, I'll take your information and take it away and do something. It was, let's do this together. Now, I mentioned Solanaceae, and I showed a picture of potatoes before, and potatoes are incredibly important on a world scale. We have, as human beings, we have 80% of our caloric intake comes from 4 plants, 4 plant species: rice, maize, wheat, and potatoes. So potatoes are that 4th non-grass carbohydrate that's important for us to use. Potatoes originated in the Andes, and they've spread worldwide in cultivation in all kinds of different habitats. Now, one of the things about potatoes is that it's a tetraploid crop, and it's propagated vegetatively, which is one of the big factors behind the Irish potato famine, which caused a huge migration of people around the world in the 19th century. So the Irish potato famine was due to late blight, which is an oomycete disease of potatoes. And because potatoes were vegetatively reproduced, the entire potato crop in Ireland was genetically identical. So once a strain of Phytophthora infestans established itself, that was it for the potato crop across the whole country, which caused untold damage and horrible suffering. So this is a tetraploid crop as well as being vegetatively reproduced. And there's a historical accumulation of deleterious mutations in a tetraploid crop because it just gets mutated, and there's never any intercrossing to improve for genetics itself to improve things. So with a group of my colleagues in China, we combined taxonomy, phylogeny, and something called genomic evolutionary rate profiling, which you look at the changes in each nucleotide in the genome, and then look at the phylogeny and identify segments of alignment that are more conserved or have changed more expected than by chance. And using this methodology absolutely needs a phylogeny, it needs phylogenetics, it needs taxonomy, it needs the ability to identify what species there are, what you're looking at, but it also needs that very, very close collaboration and not just taking something and taking it away and doing something with it, but actually collaborating. And what they found, I'm not going to show the slide, but what they found was that actually, very counterintuitively, it was the weakest diploid races which were the most important progenitors for new diploid strains of potato. So again, something very counterintuitive that came out of something that was, you'd never thought would be, I never thought I would be involved in, but it was very, very exciting. And we're moving forward with looking at crops in different ways. And this is a project which is spearheaded by Libby Elwood at the University of Florida. And this is to look at knowledge graphs, at neural network graphs, and to start with specimens in herbaria, and then to use that data, that information and metadata to pull together in a neural network graph, together with agricultural information, climate change information, environmental data, ecological information, and then to use this to query the graph with the questions that you want to ask. So one of the really amazing things about machine learning and artificial intelligence is it allows machines to ask questions that we as humans might never have thought of asking, which then reveal answers which are surprising and unusual. So we haven't done this yet. This is a work in progress. And we hope that using chatbots and using AI, that we can query this graph to really begin to ask the questions that other people want to ask, not just the questions that we want to ask. So moving now to my second C, which is conservation and solutions for nature. So if we think of cultivation and zero hunger as being solutions from nature, conservation is much more about solutions for nature. Now, as a systematist, I and my colleagues have described many new and amazing species, which are beautiful. Every new species I encounter is exciting, whether it's new to science and doesn't have a name, or whether it's something that I've just never seen before. For me, every one of these is an interaction and an encounter with another being in nature that I don't know. And so you expand your universe of things you know hugely. So as part of my work in Solanum, which Gonzalo referred to, we've done a lot of work trying to figure out not only the phylogeny of Solanum, the interrelationships of the clades within Solanum, but also the species-level taxonomy of Solanum, which has proved quite challenging, but actually it's done as a group. We do this as a collective and a collaborative. So we call this the Mega Lab. And and there's a talk on tomorrow, which is being given by Tina Sarkinen about how we've done this and what we've done and how we intend to go forward with this. We're not done yet. It takes ages, partly because I'm so inefficient, but it takes a long time, but it's really, really fun to work together with people. Because I can remember when I started out as a taxonomist, as an undergraduate, and as a graduate student, and I can remember sitting there and thinking, how am I ever going to make this decision? How am I going to decide whether what this is, if this is different to this? But actually, having a conversation with somebody else allows you to make that decision much more quickly because you have somebody to test out your ideas against. It's like having that sounding board. So conversation, again, super important. So I said about phylogeny is we've had phylogeny of Solanum since about 2005, started by my colleague Lynn Bose at the University of Utah. And she identified about 13 major clades within Solanum, and those clades have remained remarkably stable. No matter what genes we throw at these things, the clades remain remarkably stable. And so we did an analysis which, in a paper from the American Journal of Botany, of about 60% of the diversity of Solanum. And think about it, this is 1,300 species, many of which are known only from the type. So getting 60% is okay, it's not too bad. We could have done better, and we keep trying. So we have these good groups, but the relationships between these groups flip and flop. The relationship between the groups are not necessarily clear. So we're suggesting that these may be hard polytomies, and we may never be able to resolve these. But that's okay. Nature is complicated. Nature is confusing. And to me, those places where there's a problem in a phylogeny, it's almost as if you say, here be monsters. And that's where the biology is. That's where the really interesting questions arise. That's where you can really dig in and find something out about how nature works. So one of the things we can do with a phylogeny like this, which has lots and lots of the species of Solanum in it, is we can look at characters. We can look at functional traits, or traits in general, not just functional traits, but traits in general. And so a paper that we did last year, first author is Rebecca Hilgenhoff, who's sitting in the audience, is we looked at 26 characters across the genus and looked at which of these characters define the clades. We were looking at a way to help people enter this big genus, because big genera have huge problems in figuring out how to start. There's sort of those areas where people like me, systematists like me, fear to tread. But actually they're becoming more tractable. And we have a pair of symposia on the very last day of the Congress, and I hope many of you will stay for those, about these big genera and how different teams of people have grouped up, teamed up, collaborated to address some of the real challenges in working on these huge genera, which represent a quarter of the diversity of angiosperms, species diversity of angiosperms. So this is just one example from one character from this set of characters that we analyzed. And this is the presence of prickles, which are epidermal growths, and they occur on the leaves and on the stems of many, many species of Solanums. And you can see from the phylogeny in the back that there's been a single origin of prickles in Solanum. So that's great, really fantastic. This can define a clade, all very good. But what's kind of interesting about this character is it's been lost multiple times, not only within clades, but also within species, that you get populations which have prickles and populations which don't. And again, in collaborating with genetic scientists, they became interested in this, and we all collaborated together to look at the origins of prickles within Solanum, using this kind of natural laboratory of having species that both had prickles and didn't have prickles. And this paper, which is, the first author is James Satterley, who's here again, so please look him out. This paper will come out the week after the Botanical Congress in the journal Science. And what they found is that prickles, mutations in this gene prickleless, which is a cytokinin hormone biosynthetic gene, and this is the bit where I get a bit dodgy, they're involved in multiple losses of prickles across the spiny Solanums. But it's not always the same. The loss is not always the same. So different mutations occur for different losses. So the diversity of the characters becomes more complex. So the complexity, the more you dive into things, I've found throughout my career, the more you dive into things, the more complicated they get. But that actually means the more interesting they get. And there's a talk on this paper, which is happening on the last day, again, the last day of the Congress. So thinking about the characters, the traits of species, and conservation and species encounters, what we can do is think about how that can help us in this big thrust to try to achieve the conservation of life on land. And this is from a paper from the late Georgina Mace, who looked at how we could use particular types of information to help us with achieving conservation, or achieving that goal of halting and reversing biodiversity loss. And if we have the genetic library of life, that's got kind of slightly low predictability because it's quite variable. It also is going to take us a very long time to get there. Biome resilience is really important, and there'll be talks about biome resilience this week. I'm looking forward to some of those. But the thing that has high predictability, and we can do now, is to look at functional traits in ecosystems. And how we look at functional traits in ecosystems is we examine plant morphology. We look at plant morphology, we look at how these organisms are coping with the environments in which they live. So let's go out and look. And one way to do this is to look at these functional traits and look at them as a way of enabling strategies for survival. And this is another little talk that I want to advertise, which is on the whatever day the 24th is. My days have all blurred into one. And this is the presence and absence of tubers, that thing which characterizes the potatoes. So solanums have underground organs of two different kinds. They have tubers, like potatoes, or they have rhizomes, which are underground stems. And what Edeline did in her paper, again last year, and she'll give a talk about that on the 24th, is to look at the environmental factors that influence either the presence or absence of tubers or rhizomes. And they're quite different. And using this information with non-geophytes, rhizomatous species, and those with underground storage organs on the bottom, is you can look and begin to predict, under scenarios of climate change, is who will be the winners and the losers as our climate changes into the future. So last of all, but absolutely not least, I want to touch on collaboration, because this 17th Sustainable Development Goal is absolutely essential for the delivery of all of the rest. None of these can be done in isolation. None of them can be done even in a single lab or in a single university or a single botanical garden or a single museum. Collaboration across our community is actually really important for achieving any of these goals. And collaboration can take lots of different forms. We collaborate by going in the field together. We collect together. We collaborate in the lab. We do analyses in the lab together. And one example I'd like to bring out, of which there are so many talks at this IBC that I'm not going to list them, is the plant, algal, and fungal tree of life, which is a huge collaboration, which I characterize as communities coming together. And this communities coming together has been spearheaded by scientists at Kew Gardens, my neighbor down the road, but actually has involved 279 authors from 27 countries, plus many more who have contributed to this. So this is a truly collaborative global effort. And again, genus level, only 61% of the genera across angiosperms. I've heard some people say, well, that's not quite enough. But honestly, if you don't take one step, you're never going to get anywhere. And this is a really important collaborative first step, because it gives us new insights, and it also gives us some new testable hypotheses, which we can go out and collect more data, more information, study plants more, and test those hypotheses. Another example of collaboration, this time on a national scale, is the flora of Brazil. The flora of Brazil, the Brazilian Flora 2020, and I love the title of this paper, Leveraging the Power of a Collaborative Scientific Network. And this project involves so many people doing so many things together, not only looking at making species lists, but also going in the field together, discussing, having meetings, really pulling together that Brazilian flora, which is one of the hugely mega-diverse countries here on Earth. And these kinds of things, having this Brazilian Flora 2020, which has a kind of semi-agreed set of species names across a massive country, allows scientists to do things like create authoritative, taxonomically verified checklists of mega-diverse areas like the Amazon basin. Having that backbone allows that further work on a more local level. So having these collaborations and working together across countries, across taxonomic groups, pulling people together, we may have our disagreements about some things, but actually taking that step to work together is super important. And one of those, which is like the Flora Brazil Online, taking that to a global scale, is the project called the World Flora Online. Now, the World Flora Online was originally conceived as supporting the global strategy of plant conservation. But in my view, the World Flora Online has gone way farther than just that. It's an underpinning set of networks and people and technologies and ideas that support us all in all kinds of different ways of looking at plants. So the World Flora Online is made up of what are called TENs, Taxonomic Expert Networks, which involve 677 people from 69 countries. And these TENs are covering about 50% of the currently accepted species of flowering plants. That's awesome. That is pretty amazing. And this is a map of where TENs are. So they're all over the world in most continents. And there's a workshop tomorrow at 1 o'clock about about the World Flora Online. If you're interested in making one of these taxonomic expert networks for your family that you love, or joining one, collaborating, starting the conversation, please come along, and there's a whole symposium on Wednesday. But when you look at the families that have these TENs established for them, these are only the families with more than 550 species in them, because the family number distribution is very long. There's lots of families with very few species, and most of them have lots more. The green ones, the green blobs here, are families that have a taxonomic expert network established. The yellow ones are ones where there's not one yet, and the ones that have yellow around green are where this is developing. So, you know, that's pretty good. That's a pretty green set of blobs, isn't it? But there's some of those yellow ones, so anyone in the audience who's thinking about the yellow ones, get that collaboration going. So we know, as botanists, we know that plants are central to not only our lives, but to the lives of every other organism on the planet. And so the answer to why botany has got to be because it's important, because it sustains us all. If you look at the Earth's biomass in carbon, plants are 82% of the Earth's biomass in carbon. They massively outweigh any other taxonomic group. Animals are this little teeny gray triangle down in the corner, which is blown up next over here, and humans are a little tiny reddish bit at the bottom corner of the animals. So just think about that in terms of biomass, how insignificant we really are. But there are a lot of us, actually, and we have a huge and disproportionate effect on the Earth itself. It never ceases to amaze me, the Earth at night, that there's hardly anywhere that isn't marked by human activity. So we have we aren't important in terms of biomass, but there are lots of us, and we have a disproportionate effect. And 75% of us now live in cities, which means that many of us have no contact with nature on a daily basis. We don't have contact with plants on a daily basis. This is a very green place that has plants all over the roofs of this particular part of the city, but many cities look like this, with very few plants with which people can interact and have that encounter with another being. And in a way, we need to think about plant conservation and plant diversity as a set of collaboration of us with plants, but also us in cities, because cities are incredibly important for the future of biodiversity, not only of plants, but of everything else as well. But without plants, how are we going to have the rest of biodiversity in cities? So I come from the Natural History Museum in London, and we've just opened a garden, which I missed the opening of because I was here in Madrid. And this was called the Urban Nature Project. And what we have is we've completely redone the area around the front of the museum to create an outdoor gallery which talks about evolution in deep time, change in deep time, through to change that an individual can affect in today's time, and some of the changes that we might expect in the future. And this project has been super exciting. And of course, being the Natural History Museum, everybody thinks that the most important thing about this project is the dinosaur. The dinosaur was actually made in a taller right here near IFEMA in Madrid. And it is an awesome object, I must say. But actually, what's central to this garden and what's central to this outdoor gallery in a museum are the plants that are grown there. Because it's the plants that tell the story of the evolution of life on Earth in a very small space. But it's living plants, and the ability to interact with them without a lot of interpretation, to create those experiences and encounters that will be different for every person, is central to this project. And this project is converting itself into an urban nature movement, because the project itself has now expanded to schools throughout the United Kingdom, where schools are cataloging and looking at the diversity of their own schoolyards, and they themselves, the students, are developing biodiversity action plans for how they take forward the greening of their environments. So this project started as a garden, but it's ended up as an urban nature movement, but I would argue that plants are at the center of it. So thinking about collaboration again, it's easy for us to collaborate with people who are like ourselves, and it's wonderful. Having collaborations with colleagues that we'll have all during this week is fantastic. It's enriching, we get new ideas, we think of new collaborative projects, we do all kinds of new things. But actually collaborating with people that are not like us is also very, very important because they bring new perspectives to the work that we do. Collaborating with communities in the area of London, in which sat Grenfell Towers, which you Europeans may remember 7 years ago. Grenfell Towers was a large tower block which lit on fire and killed many, many people who were unable to escape. So we've worked very closely with the communities around Grenfell Towers to kind of think about what plants mean to them. So part of this urban nature garden consists of gardens that the communities have made. And in doing that discussion, I've had some amazing conversations with people about what plants mean to them and what plants mean to them in their everyday lives, even people who've lived in areas where there are very few plants for them to interact with. So communities are really important. Also that next generation. You know, that next generation, we often think about, okay, we're going to teach science to kind of undergraduates and graduate students and that'll be fine and we'll get all that. But actually, children are natural botanists. They love it. You know, have you ever seen them down there looking at a moss and picking it apart? They're fantastic. So keeping that engagement with plants through childhood and into the undergraduate and graduate student years is, again, one of the challenges that we face in collaboration. And again, this needs to be done in collaboration. It's not good enough to go into a school and tell people about things and then walk away. This is about interacting, finding out what children want to know. What do other people want to know? What's the questions they're asking? Because there's more to collaboration than you might think. We often think of collaboration as we've got different teams, common goals, we exchange knowledge, and we do production. But actually, underpinning that iceberg of collaboration are things like having good codes of conduct, treating each other kindly, having inclusive workspaces, building those truly diverse teams, and explicitly having things that are explicitly open for collaboration, which I'll come back to at the very, very end of this talk. So as we go forward and think about why botany and why now, we know plants are important, but it's up to us to make sure that everybody else, that we're able to answer that question, why botany, but also answer that question, why now? Because nature's heartbeat is what drives this planet. It drives everything that we do, although it may not seem like it is when we're sitting in a big hall with no plants around. They're out there doing their job, maintaining the environment, keeping this a place where we can live. But plants face, and natural environments, place serious threats. Local threats like destruction by fire, which is becoming more and more common as we have increasing heat waves and drying events. Also with expansion along roads being put in through areas where deforestation is happening. And so that fragile planet is subject to a huge number of threats. But we need to address those threats together and as a community and as a collective. Because as we travel this road towards those sustainable development goals, we need to do it together, and not just together as a community here, but together as a community with the other communities with which we share our space and our societies. So my urge would be that we would go away from this week thinking about answering those questions, why botany, why now, and also why together, as opposed to, I'll just do it by myself. So I want to thank all of you, and I want to have special thanks to Yadvinder Mali, Peter Moonlight and Alan Elliott, Domingos Cardoso, Hilary Goodson and Javier Gamboa, and Alexandra Zuntini and Bill Baker, all of whom lent me images and And you can find them, because I'm sure that these images might come up again in other talks throughout this week. I'd also like to thank my institution, who have been amazing at allowing me to explore all the little edges where I wanted to explore throughout my career at the Natural History Museum. I couldn't have done it anywhere else. And also the International Association for Plant Taxonomy, which has sponsored the nomenclature section, which I was at last week, and also has helped me to be here today, and the Fundación BBV, who sponsored this lecture. And I want to just say one last thing before I stop. And then you see a QR code on the page, and I'm going to change the screen so the QR code's super big. And you know, I mentioned that there was a Shenzhen declaration from the Shenzhen International Botanical Congress. Well, every botanical congress has a declaration. And the Shenzhen one was a declaration to our community, which I think our community has responded well to. And this declaration, a declaration committee has come together and made a draft of a declaration, which is much more outward-facing. It's about the why botany, why now question. It's why us, calls to action for all of society. And we want this 20th IBC declaration to be a collaborative project emerging from all of you who are here. This is a hive mind of the most extraordinary ability. And so we've created a mechanism for you to contribute thoughts to this initiative. So if you would like to contribute to the Madrid Declaration, please, there's the QR code. So please share any ideas and suggestions on this by filling out a Google form, which is available through this QR code, by Wednesday, which is July the 24th. Fortunately, it didn't just say the July 24th, because I would have forgotten that that was Wednesday, at 7 o'clock in the evening, Madrid time. So if you can contribute those ideas and thoughts, we've asked a few questions, which you can answer, and there's space for you to say what you think. And we'll consider all of these as we prepare this final declaration, which will be announced at the closing ceremony on Saturday, July the 7th. So we'd love people's ideas and suggestions, because this is that bit below the iceberg, which is about explicitly inviting collaborations, creating that inclusive community, and really trying to work together to develop something that will be our message from this IBC out to society and the rest of the world. So thank you very, very much.